Okay, I wanted to set up week five's readings this week. Welcome to week five, and please note that this will be the last week we're actually using the assigned text. Next week is all about the U.S. Constitution and the Nevada Constitution. There's links online to both of those. You can find them all over the place. So that's what we'll be looking at next week. This week I want to just touch base on, first of all, your readings in 500 years. The shorter readings, you're going to start with this guy, John Smith, one of truly the guy who made Virginia work. One of the first successful British colony in North America was Jamestown in Virginia. The original settlers suffered pretty badly after building this fort at Jamestown in 1607. It's a really poor location health-wise. There was malaria, there was salt in the water that poisoned people, and they really relied on Native Americans in the area who grew corn, squash, and beans and helped them out with food, kept them alive. Anyways, James Smith is the guy credited with making the colony finally work by forcing people to grow crops instead of look for gold, which was essentially why everyone had come to the Americas. So anyways, read his description of Virginia as it was in the early 17th century and his description of native peoples and how they lived. Essentially, he gives us this notion of nature as something that can be conquered through hard work and discipline, and that it's something that must be kind of overcome naturally. And the reason that's important is because it helps form our modern notions of nature, kind of handed down to us. And that's what your one essay is about, and I'll talk about that in a second. The next piece you'll read is by this guy, William Smythe, The Conquest of Arid America. He's writing around the turn of the century, meaning around 1900, and he's declaring how even though the precipitation in the west of the United States is low, we can conquer the west with dams and using water resources. One thing is that the people like Smythe and others who were looking at the West in the late 19th century didn't realize is that they were in a period of more rain than less. And this is California, but it gives you the same sort of idea of how precipitation actually works in the West. And it goes up and down a lot, as you can see. Some years are lots of precipitation, other years very low precipitation. This one, if you can see, it corresponds with the recent drought in California. And so what this really means is that they didn't understand how this works. And one thing they didn't understand is the drought in the West also would coincide with farming practices to lead to things like the Great Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which saw dust storms just bury literally farms under many feet of dust. This is all connected to lack of precipitation in the West and something that Smythe and his fellows didn't understand. So when you work on that essay about how the original British colonists' views of the environment develop into how we view the environment today, make this change from Smith to Smythe to Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. You've probably heard of this book before. You're going to read an excerpt from Silent Spring, which is generally credited with having launched the environmental movement, at least the modern environmental movement. It inspired the government to form the EPA eventually. Rachel Carson is talking a lot about how chemicals are being used as pesticides primarily, and how it leaches into groundwater and affects species. Interestingly, she focuses a lot on DDT, which was banned as a result of her book. DDT was a pesticide and it killed mosquitoes, among others. And Carson has actually taken some heat because the people say, using DDT, we could have eradicated malaria. Malaria is still a big problem. So, two sides to everything, but it's an important landmark in the rise of the environmental movement, her book, which really is where people first begin to look, okay, humankind is affecting the environment in negative ways, and how can we solve some of those problems? There she is, by the way. That's Rachel Carson, who wrote the book. And this is Winona LaDuke. There's a short interview with Winona LaDuke, who's a Native American Ojibwa, who's taken a lot of active role in sort of a native approach to environmentalism. Today she runs the Honor the Earth program, and among other things was working to try and block the Dakota Access Pipeline and other places where a modern environmentalism intersects with native issues. This guy maybe heard about before, Eric Schlosser. He has a brief excerpt about known as slow food. He became famous with his book Fast Food Nation. That just really looks at what we eat and how we eat, and it's actually had a huge effect. Since this book came out in 2001, I want to say, the choices you have at your local grocery store have completely transformed. I mean, organic is so easy to find these days, and there's so many examples of ways people are moving away from processed foods that tend to be bad for you and cause health problems, to slow food and raw food and other types of ways of eating that are way more healthy, both individually and as a society. And then finally, Vandana Shiva has she's considered an expert on globalism and the effects of globalism and the effects of growth in the modern economy. A real brief bit about her, where she basically critiques the modern economy. Okay, and then finally, a real interesting bit is an excerpt from this book. Now we're moved on to Sagebrush and Slot Machines. You'll be reading an excerpt from this book, Bombs in the Backyard, all about atomic testing, primarily here in Nevada. Your essay connected with this is really pretty straightforward. 3 questions, three paragraphs, 3 concise paragraphs, basically asking about the effects of this, the effects economically, the effects politically, the effects socioculturally. The excerpt you're reading goes into all that, but if you have personal experiences with this, because as someone who lives here in the area where this was taking place, please use those. Hopefully by now that I appreciate those personal reflections you offer in your essays. I did just there's great maps out there like this, but you can see this is approximately where those tests were taking place, and that radiation can be detected, iodine-131 poisoning, all the way over, as far away as Vermont. There were lots of actual deaths connected to it in north of Vegas and in Washington County, Utah, Iron County, Utah. These places with the darkest red are actually places where the highest levels of this fallout was detected. And so keep that in mind as they're blowing up those atomic bombs here in Nevada, that fallout is traveling, in some cases, thousands of miles away and affecting people. And then consider the effect just on, ordinary Nevadans. And, that radiation was everywhere. And like I said, it's connected to deaths. I mean, it's not just some sort of abstract, how could they be blowing up atomic bombs in our backyard? They're poisoning people. To their credit, they didn't realize the extent of this right away. It took them time to figure out how bad radiation poisoning can be. And by 1963, these tests had ceased due to a few different reasons, but primarily test treaties with the Soviet Union following the Cuban Missile Crisis, where both countries sort of realized if we ever do actually go to war using atomic weapons, we threaten to annihilate essentially the species, and it's not worth it. So let's start reeling in the arms race, and that began in 1963, and that's when testing primarily ended here. Okay, and then the last 2 readings are just sort of They're going to be your response readings. You have two choices. You can read about Las Vegas on the eve of the new millennium, kind of a fun piece about Vegas just over 20 or just under 20 years ago, and just the dramatic transformation it had undergone from 20th to 21st century. And then another, I think, really interesting piece from 2012 about could the Great Recession or could the Great Collapse occur again? Remember that all began with the housing bubble, and that housing bubble was real big here in the Las Vegas area. Does seem in 2018 that there are some echoes of what happened in 2007, 2008 to cause the great crash that led to the Great Recession. So read that piece, and it's an either or this week for those. You have two choices. You only have to write down one of them. Okay, I will see you on week 6 for Constitution. Thanks.